Anyway, good evening, good morning, whichever part of the world you're in. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our March webinar. And for International Women's Day, which was yesterday, it's picked One Place Women, which ties in with the blogging prompts. For those of you who are not on Twitter or haven't come across it in Destinations, we've been picking monthly topics as prompts for blogs and for focus for research. And March has been One Place Women. And I understand it, and please wave frantically if this is not the case, that we are expecting contributions from Helen Shields and from Jane Harris and from Janice Cooper and Janet Fu when she makes it. And I've got a couple of One Place Women up my sleeve for later on. So what we don't have is a pecking order as such, for which I apologise. Helen or Jane or Janice, do either of you wish to go off first? Or shall I pick on somebody? But the idea is that we are going to have brief, sort of 5, 10, 15-minute contributions from members on an aspect of women in their places that has appealed to them in their research over the past few days and weeks. And these will be different for different people, and then use those as a focus for discussion. So do I have a volunteer or shall I pounce on somebody? Helen's shaking her head. Are you happy to go first then? We unmute you, Helen. Yeah.
Well, so I'm not sure I'm best to go first, but I will go first if you like.
All right, you don't need to. I do apologise to the members that we don't have a running order, but
no, that's okay. So I'm fairly new to sharing my screen, but I'll do that in a minute. So Muriel Finch was my grandmother, and Albany, her father, was one of the Finch brothers who ran the foundry in Sticklepath. The foundry was more of a smithy, really, and employed quite a number of people. And this evening, I've invited my grandmother's stepmother, known as Auntie Kate, but she was really called Kezia Ching. She's coming to speak to us, and she is bringing some photos. And I've asked her to tell us a little bit about her daily life, her life in general, the women around her, and how times have changed. Now, with a glance in Steve's direction, Auntie Kate is late. Oh, there she is, the late Auntie Kate. Oh, thank you, my dear. Now, Willie May brought me down, you know, in one of the Hackney carriages. Very posh. I don't often get to ride in one of those. Now, you asked me to bring some photos, so just let me see if I can find those. I'm hoping. If I go to there. Now then, Steve, can you see that? Yes, brilliant, wonderful. So here we are, that's a picture of me, look. I was born and raised at Coomed Farm in Sticklepath. Of course, farming was much more manual in them days, none of this lifting aids or tractors. You dug your potatoes, filled the sacks and whipped them up onto the wagon. And there was always something us children were expected to do to help. Oh, no. There's Willie May there holding on to the horse. Now, on this photo, you can see up at the right there, you can see it was harvest time, and my twin brothers were there doing the harvesting, and Alf Rowe and Solon Borden. Now, he's a deaf and dumb chap, you know, from across the road at Tongue End. He's a marvellous blacksmith. He works at the foundry, but they always release the men to come and help at busy times, like harvest and such like. And there at the bottom, you see my nieces. Well, Phyllis, of course, was born at Coomed Farm, you say 1902, I think it were. She was any girl about to be a new mother, nearly always came home to their own mum for that first birth in them days. Now, looking at that house picture, you can see my mum and dad there, mother and father. So I think that photo must have been about, well, 1890 or so, maybe a little bit earlier. And you can see there in front of the gate, there's quite a few bushes and stuff. The road's quite a long way away from the house then. Here we are, the house on the left. that one on the left, there's still wildflowers, and you can see where the path is. You'd walk down to Stickle Path. Proper pretty it was in spring when you'd see all the wildflowers as you walk down. It's about 1.5 miles down to the Wesleyan Chapel. Well, we were chapel folk, you see. If you look at the wall there, that one on the left, it looks quite dusty, doesn't it? In the summer, the edges would be quite white with dust. Well, we were on the main road from Exeter to Cornwall, but it wasn't the smoothest of roads. Now then, they widened the road and, of course, eventually tarmacked it. And that wasn't so good for the farmhouse. You can see there, the one on the right, the wall's right up against the house now, and there's no space between the house and the walkers. I mean, well, people on Shankson's pony, that's the walkers. It wasn't a very pleasant walk at all anymore. The wall does look cleaner, I suppose, less dust, but more fumes as the cars came into fashion. And there then be my family. Goodness, didn't far short of 200 years since Eliza and George were born. Latter half of the 1820s, that were. Don't time fly? Of course, come the end of the 1920s, and I be the only one of the lot of us still standing. But there we are, the 3 sisters at the back there, Liza Ellis, myself, Kezia Huxtable. Huxtable's for my mother, you know, and then Georgina, our little Gina. And a bit later, along came the twins, Georgie and Louis. Well, I was 7 when they were born, and I suppose once Liza went into service, I was often left looking after them. Bit of a handful they were, but good training for me. Stickle Path School, of course, wasn't built then till about 1879, so it was a bit late for all of us, but we got a good education. I remember the day that photo was taken. We 3 of us had all dressed up, we pressed our frills, but the photographer made us stand at the back there. Well, we had to have a second photo. There it is, look, showing off our skirts. So I think Mother went down to the foundry with the iron, had it ground flat so that it would iron properly. And then, of course, you had to put a good fire on to heat the iron. And then, well, to press it, you'd put a damp material in between, both to protect the material and stop any dust going on, sooty marks going on there. We did take pride in our appearance, mind, and tried to keep up with fashions, but you didn't have a new dress very often. Look at that, yards and yards of material, to say nothing of all the underskirts. Sometimes we would alter the decoration on the dress ourselves, or if it was a bigger job, we'd take it down to one of the dressmakers in the village to alter. Before all that changed, by the 1920s, girls just wore a little thin slip and straight dress in a flimsy material down to their knees. Here we are, that's Muriel in a little flippy dress. You can see how it could be quite a shock to move from the tightly fitted long dresses and then these loose casual things, and no need for tightly fitting corsets anymore. But it was quite an occasion to dress up and to go to visit the studio in them days. You can see all the different waistlines and different sleeves and the different ways that the skirts are draped. Oh, look at my hair there on the right there. We learned to do that in service. We had to put our hair up, scrape it all up neat and tidy, and wear a little cap. This is Ellie. Ellie used to take charge, you know. I'm not saying she was bossy, but she was the one that took over the farm. And there she is behind Mother and Father with her little pinny on. She took care of the animals, got her name in print, you know, in one of them directories. Gina, now, she started in service as a cook. Well, age 17, she was working for Miss Lucy and Miss Mary James, daughters of a reverend gentleman. Well, he died, but they ran a dame school down at Lympston. Eliza was working there too at the start. But then Gina got married. She married Albany Finch, and they ran a guest house, or she ran the guest house in Cleve House, Stickle Path. She would take lodgers, especially in the summer, because people started coming to Dartmoor to take the air, you know, around the 1900s this were. Oh, there she is with her pram. She was very proud of that ornate pram. Not many people had prams. Not the safest thing, though. I heard of a few babies falling out, but it would have been passed on to each member of the family as new babies came along. Of course, you had to stand still for quite a while for photos then. Silly girl. Probably she was chatting, shaking her head. Shame that. Now, I was in service with a big family, parlour maid to Major Henry Borshire Toke Ray. 8 Powderham Terrace, Teignmouth. 'Twas right on the sea front. Now, there were 13 members of that family and 7 of us servants. There was the cook and the kitchen maid, the nurse and the nursemaid, and then I was the parlour maid, and I had to keep the housemaid and the page in order, as well as my duties, waiting at table, answering the door, and so on. It was a big house for us to keep clean, with the basement there, as well as 3 full floors. Of course, I always loved my hats. I could alter the decorations and make it new for each occasion. Usually I did that myself, but for real special occasions, I took it to Miss Finch, who kept the milliners in 4 Street, Oakhampton. And you can see there on the right, my soldier, my Crimean War veteran, Private William Middle. We were married in 1898. There were murmurings, of course. Well, see, he was 40 years older than me, older than my father, actually. But it was practicality and companionship. I couldn't have looked after him as a single woman, lived with him without being his wife. Anyway, being married gave me an air of responsibility, respectability. So we had a lovely little garden next to the chapel there. You can see me, proper lady of leisure, sat next to my husband with a visitor there taking tea. And here's our little house, Farley Cottage, just opposite the chapel. And that's William there with our nieces, Phyllis and Muriel. Oh, Uncle Middle and Auntie Kate, they called us. Of course, high days, holidays, and every Sunday, William would don his Crimean War medals. You see, people gathered each week before church or chapel, and they walked up and down the village, greeting each other and chatting, sharing the latest news, gossiping really. William loved all that, an audience for his stories of the war and of laying the first telegraph out to America. In those days, chapel was nearly always full, with 30 or 40 children there besides. And we always looked forward to the annual church outings and the Sunday school anniversaries, proper celebrations. Of course, we'd started having a few picnics on Dartmoor too by then as a family. And then a bit later, down on the right there, you can see we went off to Ilfracombe or Bude in a charabanc. Well, anyway, we're telling you about my marriage to William. So it was my job to keep our little house and make it into a home, do all the housework, you know. Nice to be working for yourself for a change. We had various tradesmen calling. So there was Fishy Holman, well, the fish man, Mr. Holman from South Seal, he came twice a week. And the butcher, now he came twice a week as well, but he never came till after dark. So we called him the Midnight Butcher. And then there was Mr. Runnicott's groceries. Well, he came with a covered wagon, horse-drawn, of course, with a tank built in the back for some paraffin. Of course, Gina made sure I didn't buy that paraffin because Finch Brothers sold paraffin and coal. And of course, some people still use peat to heat themselves. And then there was a baker, Marks from Oakhampton. He came with his big square basket, lovely bread, oh, cottage loaves and so on. Sometimes he had a much smaller oblong wicker basket with lids that folded just so. You'd peep inside, and there were special treats, a jam tart or a piece of cake. We didn't have them very often, of course. And then if you did get one, you'd have to pop down the road to the dairy for a quarter of clotted cream, or half a quarter anyway. And William would often give the girls a penny to spend at one of the little sweetie shops in the village. There were several ladies ran little shops in the village to help make ends meet. Now, my mother died in 1911 and William died in 1912. I like to treasure these memorial cards and the like. It was quite quick for William in the end, and peaceful, good funeral too. Lots of folks said lovely things. And soon after, I found a position down in Cornwall, in Tywardreath, near Parr. And that's where I married the second time. You see, Georgina, my sister, took ill. When she died, it was quite a shock. And about 6 months later, Albany came calling. Well, he did make business trips around Cornwall, so it wasn't too surprising. But then he told me he was struggling to look after Gina's 2 girls. Well, his 2 girls as well, of course. And then there was the house to run. And well, before I knew it, there I was at the altar. Albany told him I was a year older than him. Well, it was actually 4 years. He was 54 and I was 58. And so it was that I moved into Cleve House, Sticklepath, just opposite a little church, with a view of Cleve Valley up to Belston. Lovely house. We had an outside toilet, of course, and we didn't have electricity when I was just married. You got up with the sun and went to bed not soon after sunset. We had oil lamps, you know, and candles. And luckily, the tallow candle factory in the Sticklepath had closed down. Smelly old things, them tallow candles. So they did say you could eat it if you got desperate. So here are girls. They're on the left. That's me at the back, and Georgina, their mother, in the front. And then on the right, that's soon after we got married, with Albany. And the girls, well, being teenagers, we agreed to stick with Auntie Kate, not stepmother or something like that. Our Phyllis was a proper clever girl. Well, she went off to Bedford College in London. That's where the bob haircuts said to have started, you know. And students, well, they had lots of books in those days. There were 2 whole bookcases full, look, and a real coal fire and a table. And there's Phyllis for a degree day. And Rose, that other niece I told you about, my brother's daughter, well, she went off to the University of the Southwest, Exeter, College of the Southwest, I think. Very sporty she was. Right proud we were. Both of the girls, first ones to go to university, and both became proper high school teachers. Well, Phyllis went off then to be a Methodist missionary. She went off to China for, well, at least 15 years, as I know of. So hockey, tennis, and then cricket. Didn't know, did you, that they played cricket, the girls in Devon in the 1920s? Muriel, of course, stayed at home. She married her school sweetheart, Charlie. And when they were first married, they moved just up the road into rented accommodation, a couple of rooms, furnished rooms with Miss Warren in Ladywell House. Well, right opposite Ladywell, if you know it. And then when they'd saved up a few pennies and could buy themselves some furnishings, they went down to the house next to the foundry, and they just had a couple of rooms, as you did when you were young like that. Of course, then I took ill. Now, I'm not sure what that was. Nothing in particular, I don't think, but they moved back into Cleve House in order to look after me and to run the house. Once I'd recovered, about 1931 we're up to, I think, baby Anne was on her way. So, of course, Charles and Muriel never moved out again. Anne, of course, was born in a little private nursing home in Oakhampton. That's what they did in those days. It was run by a Mrs. Yode, being our district nurse. Oh, that little baby, so a terrible time we had with that little mite. I was still pacing up and down with her in the night so other people could get some sleep when she was 6 months old. That's one of the downsides, of course, of having a big house with lots of people in it. Oh, goodness, is that the time? Willie May will be champing at the bit, just like the horses. I must be on my way. I hope that's given you a bit of a picture of my life in Sticklepath and how things have changed over my lifetime. Cheerio now, my dears. Silenced you.
Wow, thank you very much. That was superb. I don't know if Janet Fu has joined us now, and I don't know whether her alter ego, Mistress Agnes, is looking for a late Victorian Edwardian accomplice. But
I think, well, yes, I think this.
That was
yeah.
that was fascinating. It was very evocative insight into her life and the lives of people in your place. It certainly set the bar very high. So thank you very much for going, for being brave and going first. That was excellent. I certainly hadn't thought of taking a narrative approach like that, and I think that's not something that comes naturally, but I think it's something that's challenged me to give it a go sometime. I'm not sure I'm brave enough to do it online in real time as you are. I have immense respect for that, but you never know, I might manage something in print sometime. We're getting fabulous comments in the chat.
Oh, thank you.
Fabulous, wonderful. That was brilliant, awesome, very awesome, in fact. Excellent, very interesting, absolutely amazing. So well done. Anybody got any questions or comments for Helen, either about her presentation or about the lives of the ladies that she was discussing?
Silenced you all. So a lot of it came from my grandmother, who told me stories and about her stepmother, and some of it came from a booklet about the foundry and so on. And more or less everything came from somewhere.
Yeah.
When you mentioned the Lady Well, that did remind me of one of your One Place Landmark blogs.
An excellent use of photographs. That you're lucky to have that collection as well. That was really interesting.
So I think Auntie Kate is the person that had actually collected most of the stuff, certainly all the memorial cards, and I've got quite a few things about William Middle, that Crimean War soldier as well. So his references and pension things like that. So yeah, very lucky.
And they tend to be reasonably well documented, don't they, the Crimean people? That was excellent, Helen. Thank you very much. Any more comments for Helen, or shall we stand her down?
Just an aside, Helen, did you see? I'm just noticing the Bedford College connection because I've been researching someone who was at Bedford College. The Royal Holloway Library did a fantastic presentation a few weeks back with lots and lots of photographs from Bedford College, and they colorized some of them. It was really good. I'm not sure if that's still available as a recording, but if it is available as a recording, I'll send you a link.
Lovely, thank you.
The photographs were amazing.
That's lovely, thank you very much. And that's one of the great things about this society, is how we interact with each other and support and encourage each other. As you get bits that come up for, I get something for somebody else's place and people send me stuff from my place, and that's absolutely great. Thank you. Janet, I picked on poor Helen. I said, anybody want to go first? And she shook her head and I said, thank you. Do you actually have
warn her? No, I did warn her. She might have to step in.
Do you have actually a running order? Do people know who's going second?
I don't have a running order, but I'm happy to go next if you like. Now I'm here, and I have to also apologise for everybody. I thought I had perfected the art of being in two places at once, but it appears that I haven't. So
you do pretty well being in 2 centuries at once. Anyway, I'll hand over to you then. Thank you very much, Janet.
Well, thanks also for everybody for kind of holding the fort a little bit. So just make sure I'm going to give you the right presentation, not the one I've just been giving, but I will share my screen. There we go. Usual thing where you have to wait for the menu to get out the way before you can do anything. So can we see that, Helen or Steve or Janet? They're all nodding at me. Wonderful. So this is Matilda's story, and I like telling the story of marginalised ancestors who perhaps would get lost by the wayside as just possibly a name on someone's family tree. And I particularly like to trace all the great aunts and so on, because I think sometimes if they've left no descendants, they're going to be forgotten if we don't do something about it. And I've extended that to my One Place residents as well. So this is Matilda's story. And it appears, if you've read the novel that I wrote, which is based on a true story, she appears in that. So some of you may know a little bit about her already. And what you were looking at just now is her cottage where she lived, well, all her life, really. So Matilda then was born in 1850 in one of my places, Bucks Mills, on the north coast of Devon, a little fishing village. And she was the youngest daughter, the 9th child, but the youngest daughter of 10 children. So, of course, as the youngest daughter, what happens to the youngest daughter? She stays at home and looks after mum and dad. And she lived all her life in that little cottage there, which is known as King's Cottage. In 1885, her sister Ellen spends 6 months in the county asylum, which for Devon is at Exminster. But Matilda herself, as I say, stays at home. We find her, for example, in the 1871 census, making fishing nets and apparently doing what all youngest daughters had to do, looking after her elderly parents. But after the death of her parents, she carries on living in the cottage together with her older sister, Mary, also unmarried. And then in 1905, Mary dies as well. And by January of 1908, Matilda is taken to Westminster Asylum. And in her admissions notes, it says that her sister is insane. Now, I don't think that's Ellen. Ellen appears in the book as well, so some of you may recognise her. But Ellen was only in the asylum for a year, and it's probably, having had a baby, it's psychosis following childbirth. She then goes back home. They all live in the same little village. She has umpteen children and never touches the asylum again, from what I can gather. So I don't think that in 1908 they're going to say Sister Insane, looking back right back to 1885 when Ellen spent a year there. I think the insane sister is actually Mary, who is missing from a census and can't be found anywhere. And I've tried looking under birthplace and age and, you know, without a name, and I've tried initials and things, but she doesn't seem to be anywhere. But I think it's Mary, not Ellen. So there could be three sisters, all of who clearly had mental health issues. But the wonderful thing about asylum records, of course, is that you get physical descriptions. And so I know what Matilda looked like. There's no photograph of her anywhere. So she could be a completely forgotten woman. But no, so we know that she has a defective memory. She keeps scratching her face. She's old. In fact, she was 58. So yeah, well, we'll gloss over that one. Well nourished, marked cavities, a slight beard and moustache, dark eyebrows, blue eyes, a pale complexion, flushed cheeks, a faraway expression slightly worried in character, teeth bad, and weight 7.5 stone. Well, I'll take that last bit, but I don't really, you know, she doesn't really conjure up a very attractive portrait there, but she'd obviously had quite a hard life anyway, quite apart from the mental health issues. But we also know a little bit about her symptoms. We know that she was suicidal, that she complained of roaring noises in her head, which she'd had for years, so some kind of tinnitus perhaps. Worse if she had catarrh, as in catarrh, not guitar. A dull, melancholic manner. We know that she had some kind of psychological paralysis. She said she couldn't walk and she'd lost the use of her legs. But she does admit trying to get out of the window at home, and that's not a downstairs window, that's an upstairs window. And I've done a fair bit really about people with mental health issues, and this seems to be quite common, that whether it's, you know, you think you can fly or something, but people trying to get out of upstairs windows doesn't seem to be unheard of. They interviewed the family, and her brother said that she was naturally quiet in nature and had good conversation. But the symptoms go on. So we find that she's got insomnia and she's very noisy at night. She says she hears voices and she's about to be killed. So she's got a persecution complex as well. And then she says she's only got a bit of her tongue, and she's got no stomach and nothing goes through her. But she's also constipated. So there's a digestive problem there as well. She frequently gives way to swearing and says the devil has changed her tongue. Now, this is quite interesting, because it says that she was formerly happy in her religious faith, but of late she says she's going to hell. Excuse me. And this is something that you see again and again in the asylum admissions records, this link with religious fervour, religious extremism. Sometimes it's described as religious mania. And she belonged to a branch of Methodism known as the Bible Christians that was quite prominent in Devon. And they were a nonconformist, fairly hellfire and damnation branch of Methodism. And I've come across it more than once. She, like others, was quite comfortable within that religion. But remember, this is a woman who is listening to really quite fiery sermons with the threat of eternal damnation thrust at her a couple of times every Sunday. So it's fine while you think you're behaving, but if you think you've transgressed, you've obviously think you've lost your eternal soul as well. She had to frequently be restrained from injuring herself, and says she didn't want to live. Well, we already had the suicidal, but that too. And so she tries to escape. Now, we don't know what prompted her attempt to escape, and we don't know how she escaped, although I did make something up for the purposes of the novel. But she's found in December hanging by her nightdress from the railings of the asylum. And she kept saying, I want to see the water, I must get at the water. Well, this is a woman whose cottage is in sight of the sea. It's the last cottage in the village. If you go any further down the road, you're in the sea. And of course, now she's incarcerated in a fairly soulless looking, typical Victorian asylum. And although it was freezing cold, literally freezing cold that night, they got her down and she didn't die of hypothermia or anything. She did survive, but she did die in the asylum a few years later. She never went back home. And I think Matilda's story is important because otherwise she's forgotten. And we need to seek out the people in our one places who just appear to be sitting there with nobody to love them and nobody to preserve their memory. Not only those in our own families, but those who we're involved in researching as part of our one place studies as well. So that's Matilda. She only has a very short story. I mean, there was other things to her life that we will never know. We never know whether she had a young man at any point. We never know how she felt about having to stay at home and look after her parents when the rest of the family had fled the nest, though Mary came back, but only after her parents had died. The cottage was actually left to Mary and Matilda jointly. The other three daughters had all married. So we don't know. I mean, it was obviously the expected thing in Victorian times that that's what the youngest daughter would do. But we don't know how she felt about being torn away from her family home and being put in the asylum. I mean, she's obviously already in a really fragile mental state. And I suspect that that did her no good whatsoever. There was certainly no kind of care in the community. And the brother who had given information on her admissions record, he did live in the same village. And it reads, because this is more detail than I've given here, that he had tried to look after her as best he could, but he was considerably older than her, one of the oldest children in the family, and it was obviously too much for him to continue to do so. So there's Matilda, and I've brought her back to life for 5 minutes for you. And I can't rival Helen, I'm afraid, but I just thought I would like to share what happened to her. So thank you very much. There we go.
Thank you, Janet.
And I think we've got Jane and Jan, haven't we, on our running order? We haven't got a running order. We're not nearly organised enough for something like that. And I can't see either of them for a minute. I hope they're here. Right. Oh, there's. Would you like to unmute yourself?
Do you want me to go?
Yes. Yeah. Go. Give it a go. All yours.
Okay. All right. Let's do the share screen bit. This worked well earlier, but it seems to be taking some time to load. I don't know if you can see my screen at all.
Yeah, you're fine.
Yes. Oh, well, I can't. So you're a step ahead of me. Okay, well, I'm taking you to the other end of the country, to the Orkney Islands and to the parish of Walls. And I'm looking at a woman called Euphemia Sanderson, born around 1819 in one of those gaps in the old parish registers. Now, I have no idea what you're seeing at the moment because I can't see a thing.
Seeing Crockness Shore.
Oh, right, so you've gone two ahead. I'll go back. I think that should be one of her family outline. I'll do my best to remember the number of clicks and see how this is going. She's the third of 6 children. She wasn't the youngest, but she's the one who stayed at home for reasons that will become clear. 2 sisters married, one went into service, and the brothers disappear after about 1841. I don't have any pictures of her, but I do have what I hope you can see now is a picture of the Crockness shore, which is very close to where...
You're 2 ahead,
oh, sorry.
Jane.
I'm going to see if I can do something to escape from this.
I can't understand why you can't see it.
No, I'm going to try and escape. What
do you want to do it from there, and we'll ignore what's down the side? Can you see it now?
I can see. If you want to ignore what's down the side, that's fine.
Yeah, we'll ignore what's down the side, because you're going to need to see it, aren't you?
Yeah, I am. It's hopeless. So this is where I first came across Euphemia in the 1861 census, which I looked at for my Strathclyde diploma. It's a 3-generation household, not that unusual. But what is more unusual, perhaps, is that there are 3 brothers with 2 different surnames, which is different to Euphemia's own surname, and she's an unmarried woman. I got to know her a little better when I started looking at the Kirk Session records. Kirk is the established Presbyterian church in Scotland, and the session is the local court, if you like, the elders and the minister. And at this point in the 19th century, as earlier, not only did they have a spiritual role and looking after the church, but they were also very interested in the morals of the parish. Things like swearing, Sabbath breaking, and particularly fornication, antenuptial fornication. And that was why Euphemia was before them in October 1852 for trilapse fornication. So this was her 3rd time of having a child outside marriage. And she clearly knew the drill very well, because she gave them all the details. At this point, I began to think of her as something like a Polly Garter from Dylan Thomas's Under Milk Wood type character, kind of happy-go-lucky. Yeah, here's all the information. But things later changed my view on that. Anyway, despite giving all this information, it wasn't enough for the session, and they cited her to appear again. So about 18 months later, here she is. And the session can't make up their minds, so they refer the case to presbytery. That's the next level up, a grouping of parishes, the ministers meeting together at fairly regular intervals. And it's not uncommon for when cases of trilapse fornication to be referred onwards. The advice came back that she should appear before presbytery. And just for good measure, the Kirk Session in Walls admonished her again. The session minutes are quite silent on what form that rebuke took. In some places, like St Andrews, you have a chair of repentance where people would have to sit as a punishment for whatever their sin was while the congregation or other people went past. They might even have to sit in front of the congregation. Anyway, she was cited to appear at the presbytery meeting. It was happening about 2 or 3 days later, and she didn't appear. Now, it was in Strumness, which is the 2nd town in Orkney, so to get there would have meant a boat trip and probably most of a day taken to get to and from there. This was a woman with a young family, short notice, an elderly mother as well. It was asking a lot. So either she was too harassed to go, or she just thought, I'm not going, they'll have to do without me. Be that as it may, she didn't go. But eventually, almost 2¼ years after the story started, the session finally were satisfied. The minister in Walls up here in Orkney got a letter from the minister of Assynt, which is in northwest Scotland in Sutherland, containing a letter from the schoolmaster in Drumbaig, a tiny little township. And this schoolmaster was saying that he had seen Cathal Kerr, who acknowledged that he was the father of Euphemia's child. That was it. sorted. They believed her, and the minutes record that because she had been truthful, had been rebuked, and apparently appeared before presbytery, she was restored to full church privileges. So far, so good. Life carries on. The details about her are found mainly in the censuses and in the life events of her wider family. I'm not going to go through them all there, but in many ways she was something of a put upon woman, I think. 1871, she's got her elderly mother. She has a niece, the illegitimate daughter of her sister Frances, and these 3 lodgers, all hawkers. I just wonder if no one else had been willing to take in these kind of itinerant tinkers, salespeople and so on. Or was she so desperate for money, or probably good payment in goods rather than money, that she was willing to take them in? I don't know. Her son William had married and moved, so that took away some income. He'd also been a fisherman. That took away food as well as income. 1821, she's moved, mother and sister are gone, and her second son, John, a fisherman, had died from blood poisoning. And so it continues through to 1901 census, and in each of these censuses, up to the age of 70 and beyond, she is recorded as a crofter or farmer. Of Calder Kerr, the son whose father was sought with so much zeal, there is no trace after 1861. I'd love to find him. But she does get one moment on the wider stage. 1888, the Crofters Commission. This was a new body set up, and part of its function was to judge fair rents for crofters in the crofting communities in Scotland. So this was another trip to Stromness, but this time for a good reason. She was applying for a rent reduction. And this little summary of her statement, there was a paper application in advance, but also people appeared before the assessors and stated their case, if you like. I think it gives considerable insight into her life. Now, at this point, she was almost 70. She was living in an area called Heliel, and she has 1 cow, 1 ox, and 1 sheep. I hold over 2 acres arable. That's not a lot of land. It's less than half what they had when they were living in Crockness, and I suspect this explains why they moved. Lower rent and less land to work. But even then, with the lower rent of £2 per year, she still had arrears. But she had made improvements, and most of these improvements must have been done by this woman in her 60s. Kind of thing it might have been, would have been draining, putting in ditches and so on. Hard physical work. And she'd spent £2 on a buyer. Possibly, probably with some help from the landlord. The estate records don't survive for that time. She had some grazing rights on nearby hill of Bingyafee and in Crockness. Don't know why she didn't want to go to Crockness. It could have been distance, 2 miles along the shore. We'll never know. But there was good news for her this time, because the rent was fairly substantially reduced and some of her arrears cancelled. I imagine that that must have been a huge relief to her. But life had one last blow to throw at her. On May 1905, she applied for poor relief. She must have been pretty desperate to do that, and the application was refused. She has a croft and some animals, is the bare phrase in the Register of Poor Law Applications. 4 months later, she died with the cause of death, general debility with cardiac failure, 5 years. The Register of Poor Law Applications, unusually in her case, leaves the column, is this person wholly or partially disabled? That column is left blank. Possibly by omission. There is part of me also that wonders, was it guilt on the part of the Poor Law Inspector, who was one of her fellow islanders? She probably knew him. But given her condition when she died, I would have thought that in May, it was pretty much the same. I just hope that her niece, the wonderfully named Fanny Doris, who is still remembered in the island, was of some assistance to her. There is no gravestone for Euphemia Sanderson at all, but it's likely that she's buried at St. John's, this little church here, which is almost equidistant between her birthplace in Crockness and Heliel or Heildale, where she spent the last part of her life. I said at the start that I tend to think of her, or initially I did, as a Polly Garter type figure. But actually, looking at the whole of her life, I think she was a woman with few choices, like many in her generation in rural Orkney. You could either marry, like two of her sisters, go into domestic service, like the third sister, or work at home. One illegitimate child, a bit more difficult. By the time you have 2 and then 3 illegitimate sons, your choices are even more limited. And there's also the harshness of authority. The Kirk session with the elders. This was not a parish where the elders were the great and good. There were no great and there were no good. There were just some people who were slightly less poor than the others. Some of them would have been people who lived within half a mile of her, and there they were judging her. And then the poor relief inspector. And what about the 3 men who were the fathers of her children? I think it's 3. There is no mention in the Kirk session of the father of the second child at all. There must be a gap in the records. What about them? And I wonder, did Cathal Kerr, so far away in Assynt, did he ever pay anything towards the upkeep of his son? As Janet said, these are the lives that could be totally forgotten, but they're the lives that I think begin to come alive, if that's not a contradiction, because of some of the less common types of record. Thank you very much. And apologies that this had not worked at all as a screen share. I've tried it twice this afternoon, but hey ho, there's technology for you.
Thank you very much, Jane. That's fascinating and interesting that you've moved us to the other end of the country too, which I think it's rather nice. I think we have a contribution from Janice next. Is that correct, Janice?
Yes, that's right.
Lovely.
From the other side of the world.
Even better. I was just about to say, now all we need is another country. So it's over to you.
I haven't used a screen share and I've only got a couple of slides, so whether I should try or
entirely up to you.
Is it a matter of just sharing the screen as it says?
Just click on the bottom, the green button at the bottom, and it should do what it says, and then we can see whatever's on your screen. So if you don't want us to see it, don't do that.
Can you see anything?
No. So if you share the,
I might give it a miss. I've only got a few.
Okay, tell the story without
yes.
without the pictures.
Now, mine's what I was going to say is a very different approach. Some years ago, I discovered a short article in a newspaper that mentioned 4 of my female ancestors as working for Red Cross in World War I. During that centenary period, I did some work on the enlistments from the area, from the town and district, and came across this article. And of course, that's what attracted me to it. But I learnt a little about my own family, but was interested in the other women in the group. So what I did was research the 21 women as a total, just to put my own family into context. And what I thought I'd do today is just sort of talk about the process. I have written an article for the next destinations to fill out the story, and so that's what I'll do. I'm always interested from my own family of adding those people around them, small groups, and this was an ideal group to have a look at. I guess the next step was to collect the data, and I was lucky enough to get enough data on most of the women, well, all of the women really, some more, some less, of the 21 people, using the usual genealogical sources, but also for us, electoral rolls, because we don't have census, and newspaper articles. And I thought I was fairly lucky in getting details about 21 women living in a small country town in a big rural district, or big by comparison to what you think of anyhow. Then looking at the data, I really analysed some of the aspects of this group of women to discover that most of them were married women, 16 of them were married, 5 of them single. Ages varied from, I think the youngest was 13 or 14. And although it's a bit difficult to discover how old the older women were, I would think that they would be in their 50s. Certainly my own family members, the elder ladies, were in their 50s. I then thought about whether they were living in what we call the town or the country, whether they were in the little town or on one of the properties surrounding. And I think 8 of the women, or I know 8 of the women, had to travel into town for meetings or working bees if they got together. They probably didn't come to town to actually create the materials and the bits and pieces that they sent off for the war effort. But one woman would have had to have travelled about 18 miles, 29 kilometres to town. I know my grandmother used to walk the 3 miles into town. That stage, the cars had been in the district for about 4 or 5 years. So I'm assuming that the country women, wealthier women, or their husbands, would have been able to travel by car by then, rather than sulky or buggy or some form of transport, other transport. I looked at the occupations, had to consider that most of those women would have, of course, had home duties, but there were 3 teachers amongst the younger women, and there was one of the older women was a hotel licensee, so one of the local pubs. Looked a little at the social status, and that would have been dependent on their husband's or their father's position, and it varied quite considerably. This was a very mixed group in local terms. The graziers and the town businessmen would have given their wives or daughters the highest status, and there was the wife of one of the local labourers. I don't think status meant very much to this group of women, because they had a common endeavour, and that was to raise money, produce items that they could send off to the war effort. A couple of the women actually had close connections to the war because of their own sons enlisting. In fact, the president had, well, she was president at one stage. Maybe she wasn't president at this stage. This was this article came from 1917, so rather late in the war. The committee had been going for some period during the war. In fact, I think it was formed soon after the formation of the Red Cross in Australia, which happened during World War I. So Private Reginald Hawkins, who was an adopted daughter of one of the women, he was actually a prisoner of war. And in fact, from my study of the World War I enlistments, he was the only prisoner of war that I can identify from, excuse me, from the whole community. He did return home. So. One of the other women had 2 sons, although the younger son, while he enlisted, it was so late in the war, he didn't actually leave Australia. It's difficult to determine how many of these women were actually what you might call local residents, local in a country town in Australia or in Queensland in particular. You know, they say you have to be there for, 15 years plus before you're considered a local. So it's a bit hard to define who is local and who isn't. A lot of travelling working people, and also some of the women would have been fairly temporary residents because their husbands were public servants. So transfer in the railway department or in the education department and would have moved on after a few years. So the reason why I've called this particular piece of writing I've sent in, Women Taking Charge, this group of women I thought was particularly significant in the locality because they, to me, provided a model for so many of the later organisations. For example, in the 1920s, there was an ambulance committee formed, and these women would have been amongst some of the women who were involved in raising money at that stage. Some of them had had that experience in management or in committee work to get that experience. CWA, Country Women's Association, Queensland Country Women's Association branch, was formed in the 1920s as well, and so they would have, in a women's only organisation, taken management roles immediately. But soon after, a group called the Bush Nursing Association was formed, and this was an association, an Australia-wide association that provided medical services for small towns that didn't have their own hospitals. And some of the women who were involved in the World War I effort, the Red Cross group, were very involved in the Bush Nursing Association. In fact, in its first 25 years, women were involved as secretary or treasurer over the whole period. And of particular interest is a girl who would have been she would have been about 7 at the time this Red Cross group was formed, or by the time the article was appeared in the paper, the local paper. She became an assistant in the local government, an assistant junior clerk when she was about 17. Became Shire clerk in the 1940s until she got married. And then in the 1960s, or from 1964 to 76, became the chair of the local council. So as a young girl, she would have seen the work that these women had done and how they were managing their own group, acting as president, secretary, treasurer. And so I'm sure that she would have seen this as an example. She was one of the first women to actually hold that role in local government in Queensland. So, yes, that's an interesting group of women, and I think quite important group of women in the local community. And you can read more about it when you read the Destinations article. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much.
Answer any questions or make any comments.
It was lovely to get a different perspective and a different way of doing things, and I think that's what I enjoy about this group, and the fact that we all have our own take on various things, and it's lovely to hear what other people are doing. Now, I happen to know that Janet Barry might have something possibly to contribute, but she's been very quiet up there, hoping that I'm going to forget that she said I could talk about something if you want me to. So would you like to, Janet, as you've...
I don't mind. It is now 9:30, so of course we advertise this as lasting an hour, and if anybody feels they either have to leave or don't particularly want to listen to me, that's absolutely fine either way. But just very briefly, I'd like to discuss two women from my one place study place. They're both similar in that they lived at the same time. They would have worshipped at the same church, I do know that. So they would have known each other. And my place isn't a big place anyway. They both had money, and they both had charitable intentions with their money, but they differ in how they got their money and how they use that for the benefit of other people. The first woman I'd like to mention is a woman called Mary Ann Ashworth. She was born 1808. And she was the daughter of two relatively well-off families. So she inherited land from both parents. She inherited the income that came with the land. And she also inherited a share in the profits of a number of collieries. I'm not aware that she ever did a day's work in her life, and I certainly have no indication whatsoever that she ever went near a coal pit. But she did very well out of it. At the age of 55, she married a gentleman called Charles Patrick, who was a sub-inspector of factories. And she entered a settlement in anticipation of marriage prior to this to ensure that her interests in her assets were protected. She, throughout her life, was charitable in the usual way in this community, with community teas and letting her tenants off paying rents when the cotton famine hit in the northwest of England and things like that. But she always kept an interest in the land that she inherited from her mother, which is about 1.5 miles away on the opposite side of the valley. And in 1873, beg pardon, she endowed a school in that area. The community was growing with the increase in the factories, increase in the mills. There were people moving in, there were more children, and she endowed a school. Interestingly, the foundation stone of that school was laid with full Masonic ceremonial, and I wasn't aware there was a Masonic way to lay a foundation stone, and if anybody has any resources on that, I'd be interested to read them. And the school building was further licensed for Anglican worship in 1876, and she identified land and money for a church, an Anglican church, and for the parsonage, but died before they were completed. So she's a woman who inherited money and lived off, in many ways, the profits of others. She married, but managed to keep control of her own income during her marriage, and she used it in a tangible way in endowing buildings and institutions for the benefits of people who were largely her tenantry. The other lady is a lady called Bathsheba Davenport. She died in 1895, and she was a milliner. So she did work, she earned her money, she had a job, and managed to keep hold of the control of her money because she was a spinster. And I'm not aware that she endowed anything or did particularly much philanthropically when she was alive. But at her death, she left money in her will to establish a charity for the benefit of such blind persons who are deserving objects in the judgment of her trustees, and who are members of or attend any of the chapels or churches in 4 of the local communities. And such individuals were paid 5 shillings per week for life or for the period of their blindness, whichever was the sooner. She obviously had an interest in blindness because she left money to nieces or nephews who were blind, but only for the duration that they remained blind. And as an aside, reversible causes of blindness in 1893, 95, it was round about the time that cataract surgery was beginning to develop. So whether a spinster milliner in a small town in East Lancashire had any ideas of benefits in ophthalmology in the United States and Austria, I've absolutely no idea. But reversible causes of blindness in itself is interesting. This charity actually continued until 2007 when it was finally wound up and the money was donated to the parish church. What I'm not aware of is whether it actually paid a dividend. I did write to both the church and to the trustees asking if it was possible to get details of beneficiaries from more than 100 years previously, but never received a reply. And I'm not aware whether it did actually not pay a dividend as such, I'm sorry, but pay out to the beneficiaries of the worthy blind church members of the community. But I thought it was interesting to contrast these two ladies who, whilst both of some substance, almost epitomise the different ways in which women in that generation managed to acquire money, managed to hang on to the use of their own money and managed to use it for the benefit of others. And I don't know whether other people in their places have got any lady philanthropists that have acted either in similar or in different ways.
Thank you very much, Janet. That's yet another perspective, and someone of a rather different, or two ladies of a rather different nature than perhaps some of the other ones we've heard about tonight. And I am very conscious, as Janet said, of the time, but you know we're all still here and willing to chat if anyone wants to make any comments or ask any questions of any of the people who've done a little presentation tonight, or indeed if anyone would like to do something similar later in the year. There are still some gaps on the programme which I've left deliberately because I'm waiting for the second half of the year blog topics to be announced to see if we can do another one similar to this. So as soon as someone's decided what they are, can someone tell me? And I'll see if we can get some talks. Helen's got her hand up. Yes, Helen, would you like to unmute yourself and go?
I just wanted to ask Janet whether she thinks maybe this lady had a strong religious belief and therefore she believed in miracles and miraculous cure of your blindness. And that might be why she said that.
That's an interesting perspective that I hadn't considered. So yes, I will think of that. I think she did have a strong religious belief. She was certainly active within the parish, and she specified churches of a range of denominations and a range of communities from which the beneficiaries could attend. Wow, belief in miracles in late 19th century East Lancashire, that would be a fascinating area for study.
Sounds like a PhD topic, doesn't it? But not mine.
In that parallel universe with plenty of time, Helen. Yes, that's very interesting. Thank you.
Yes, it's interesting actually how religion comes up, because I feel that religion played a part in Matilda's story as well, and actually religion probably played a part in our Orkney story too, in that it was the religious attitudes that led to that as a case study. Jill's got her hand up. Go for it, Jill.
Just to say thank you for the inspiration for all the lovely women. I was conscious that I should have done something about a lady from ours called Sarah. I put her photograph up as my profile because I had to be doing something else just now. But I was listening intently, and watching as much as I could, because it's just, I need to do more of this and I'm not doing more of it. So Sarah MacKillop is known as the Queen of Enderloch. There's a fantastic photograph of her. And she's just a very ordinary lady, but because she was clearly fairly extraordinary in the community, she's got a really amazing postcard, and the local area is named for her.
Wow.
Just in that thing. So sort of from the very ordinary to something that has a long, a lasting legacy.
There's always options to contribute blog posts or articles to destinations for any of you who feel you've missed the boat tonight, of course. It's all gratefully received. Anyone else like to ask a question? There's probably almost few of us enough for you to just unmute and shut.
I'll just mention,
joke,
since you, no, actually, now I'm going to be serious for about 30 seconds, make the most of it. You mentioned about the prompts, and I've had feedback from people and extra ideas. I did have a list of the next 6, but that has changed radically. The list is there, there we go. And it's been sent off to destinations, to Karen for the next destinations. But I will give you a heads up, Janet, so that you can think about.
Yeah, I think it would be nice to do another one. We've got a couple of gaps in the autumn, and I think it would be nice to do another one similar to this that ties in with the month's prompt. I must admit, I've been very remiss with the blog prompts myself, but there we go. Anyone else want to chip in with women of their place, or are we all zoomed out now? Right, well, in that case, I would like to thank Anna very much for stepping in and hosting at what really was the last minute when I discovered the meeting that I thought was going to end at 8 o'clock didn't end till 1:30. And then they started it really late as well. And I'm thinking, no, please don't start late because it's going to finish late. And thank you to all our contributors tonight. And thank you to the rest of you for coming along and making it worth us holding a meeting. So it's been really nice. It's, yeah, I always enjoy these meetings, and I think we get a lot out of sharing with each other, learning from each other and pinching each other's ideas shamelessly, which I think is all par for the course with One Place Studies, really, and what it's all about. So we will see you next month. Next month, I believe it's a look at DNA, which is she trying to remember without looking at the programme. Janet's nodding at me, that's a relief. And so all back here in 4 weeks' time. Thank you very much.